Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Get Up and Job Search with Martin McGovern and Career Therapy. Today, we have another guest this week, second guest this week, Jenny Lustig, who is a tech recruiter, senior tech recruiter, and I'm excited to chat with her and get some insights into the recruiter mindset. We get this question all the time from folks. What are recruiters looking for? What are they? How do we get in touch with them? All the different questions about the job search. So if you have questions about recruiters, about recruiting, put them in the comments. We'll be bringing up your questions throughout the conversation as well. And we'll just get right into it. I'll bring Jenny into the stream here. Good morning, Jenny. How's it going?
Hey, Martin. Good morning. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for getting up bright and early and joining the live stream.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm excited to get into all the details and nuances of what it's like from a recruiter standpoint to look at the job search. But before we get into that, introduce yourself. Let us know how did you get into recruiting, and what's going on in your life right now.
Yeah. So as you said a little bit, I'm a senior tech and product management recruiter based out of New York. But I certainly didn't start in recruiting. I've actually pivoted and switched careers twice. I actually majored in apparel merchandising. So I really thought that I was going to pursue a degree in corporate retail and did for a couple of years. And, later on switched into project management, and I was a PM for several years. And then, Martin, as you know, I moved out to Chicago back in 2012 and did a local tech boot camp there. So I learned how to code and build websites, and it really opened my eyes to the tech community. And I just wanted to get involved in however I possibly could. I loved being surrounded by passionate technologists. And so I kind of randomly found my first recruiting job at a staffing agency. Worked my way up there. Then I transitioned over to recruiting in-house for Accenture, the big consulting firm. And then I moved over to McKinsey as a big consulting firm as well. And currently work for a global fintech here in New York. So bit of a crazy zigzag trajectory, but absolutely love being in recruiting and excited about talking to your community today.
Absolutely. That's amazing. It's really fun to hear people's journeys because, everyone has this idea that the job search is this sort of linear path, and, almost never is it this linear path, right?
Yeah.
I got to change your
mind. So true.
There it is. And so, you say zigzaggy, but zigzaggy is so common, and it's interesting how you had a lot of like experiments and, learning new things that maybe weren't exactly related to the job that you're doing, but are like tangentially related, or, you learned coding. Maybe you don't code every day, but you work with a lot of coders. So walk us through some of the, decisions that you made in your sort of educational growth over the years that you have now seen pay off, but maybe didn't see how they would pay off when you were doing it.
Gosh, that's such an interesting question in so many regards, and I really like it. When I majored in fashion, I never thought about doing something in tech, doing something in recruiting. I mean, it kind of never came to mind for me. I think what kind of worked for me when I was looking to switch careers is just being so open-minded about what may come next, as well as how can I best utilize what my strengths are? The strong different parts of my different backgrounds that I could almost cherry pick and kind of bring together into that perfect kind of career path. And it certainly did not come overnight. It certainly took me a few months to really kind of figure that out for myself. But I have to say, on the recruiting side, I personally love seeing people zigzag, because I've been there and I know how hard it is. And so I appreciate when somebody has gone through those challenges and really come out on top in so many ways.
That's cool. Yeah. It almost seems like, if you look back through anyone's career, you can always see sort of like little strands that connect, right? Like knowing about fashion definitely helps in the job search because how you present yourself is such an important piece of like showing up. Like so much of an interview is the impression you make, right? And so it's funny how like all these little things that we pick up over the years do end up playing into whatever we end up doing, even if it's just like, in the mesh, in the weave. Um, when when you got into recruiting, what was it that sort of piqued your interest? What do you enjoy most about being a recruiter?
Yeah. I mean, I really love the fact that I'm helping both sides in so many ways. Like, as a recruiter, I'm really married to helping my company. That's really my first and foremost responsibility in terms of adding value to our teams, right? That's what I'm always keeping top of mind when we have a new job posting, because I want to make sure that I'm not just filling a role. I'm, adding somebody to the team that can, really help to add value in a multitude of areas, right? That's really the ideal kind of a situation. And so I love the partnership with hiring managers that I get to build as being an in-house recruiter. It's really lovely to hear, more about their teams and where their challenges really lie and how I can help them in so many ways by finding, that great next, addition to their team. It's kind of cool that way. And then on the flip side, helping candidates to, really find that great next job, helping them to really build and shape their career. So it's essentially a lot in terms of like matchmaking, which a lot of people don't think about, but it's really like finding that person who, really can add that great balance in so many regards. And, helping, people to really find that great next step for them as well. So I just love building relationships on both sides is I think
That's
the
awesome.
critical piece for me.
And just taking a step back, I think there might not be a great understanding on the job seeker side of the different types of recruiters.
Mm.
Could you give a little bit of a breakdown of like the recruiting industry and the different types of recruiters, in-house, external, and so on and so forth, independent? What are all the different types of recruiters?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this because I feel like a lot of times people just lump recruiters into just one big bucket. And there are a few different types. And it is really important to better understand the different types. And when you're talking with a staffing agency recruiter versus an in-house recruiter, to level set expectations
Hmm.
of what that relationship might end up translating into. So I'm happy to clarify. So, and it's kind of especially prevalent since I used to be a staffing agency recruiter and then transitioned in-house. So I understand both sides pretty well. So on the staffing agency side, what's different is that, they have multiple clients. They are client facing, hired by different companies to help them to fill typically they're harder to fill roles is what I would say is commonly the norm, although not always the case. Sometimes, especially like startups, if they don't have an in-house recruiter, they might turn fully to a staffing agency to help them even with their like general day-to-day hiring as well. So it can vary. But I think the important thing to keep in mind here as a candidate is that when you're working with a staffing agency recruiter, it's almost like a one-stop shop in a lot of senses because they can essentially turn you on to a multitude of opportunities that maybe you wouldn't have had an in with otherwise. So it's kind of great in that sense to connect with a staffing agency recruiter that could then submit you to multiple companies. Now, on the flip side of that, right, I think there typically can be a lot less relationship building when it comes to working with a staffing agency recruiter. Typically, they just want to get like a general gist of your background and where they might be most apt to place you, because they're very commission centric. They get paid when you get the job. So, they are incentivized to place you in that role. I think that's a good segue into how is it different working with somebody like myself who's an in-house recruiter, because I have no incentive personally. Like I'm not bonused on how many people I place. And I actually think of that as a good thing in a lot of ways, because I'm not forcing anything, right? I'm not forcing the conversation to say, hey, I really think you should take this job, or, to the hiring manager, like, you've got to hire this person. I've actually had conversations with hiring managers where I've talked them out of hiring candidates because I didn't feel like that was truly the right fit for their team. And I wanted to work with them to truly find that right person. So
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
yin there as well. But yeah, an in-house recruiter, I'm spending a lot more time and investment, at least me personally, getting to know you, getting to know your background, not just like the basics on your education, your work experience, but I want to know what makes you interesting and different, right? Like, those kind of conversations really excite me. Like, I had one really cool conversation with a candidate a while back where he had taken a sabbatical and traveled throughout Europe and Asia for like 8 months. And so I took a few minutes at the beginning of our call and asked him like what his major takeaways were from that and where he kind of thought that might translate to his next opportunity, right? So I love talking about those kinds of things versus a staffing agency recruiter might just get down to brass tacks. They're going to focus on those basics, right? I recommend working with a combination of both and seeing, what might make the most sense for you, especially if you're at the beginning of a job search and not quite sure, right? It never hurts to kind of test the waters in both areas, but kind of good to understand that a recruiter isn't just a recruiter.
Right.
Yeah.
I appreciate that breakdown. I think that's really helpful for folks to hear as well. You mentioned that you've had times where you've talked a company out of hiring a candidate because you want to make sure that they have the right person in that role. I think that that's a really interesting piece to look at. What do you feel makes someone like right for a role? Is it hard skills, soft skills, combination? What's your breakdown of like, how do you assess a potential candidate?
Yeah. Gosh, that's such an interesting one, right? And I feel like it's really tough to have a one size fits all answer, for that, right? I think it just vastly varies in all honesty. But what I can say is that, I typically like to look for that X factor. I look for those A players, not just somebody who checks like the basic boxes of a job description and seems like they're a general culture fit, right? Like, I'm looking for somebody who, maybe kind of just blows the job description out of the water. They're adding value in several different areas. They've got really interesting, meaty ideas that I could see strategically adding value to the team, to our company. And so those are people that I'm going to fight for behind the scenes. I think that's one thing that candidates don't really realize is that recruiters can really be that cheerleader for them, like within the company. Like, that's often what I'm doing is, especially if maybe a resume doesn't fully translate to telling the hiring manager what I think they need to hear and see. I'll be that translator, if you will. I'll kind of bring things to life and I'll say, you know what, I know that this person doesn't have X, Y, or Z listed on their resume, but here's some additional things that I think you're going to love about this person and why I think you should consider them. And I actually think that that's incredibly critical for somebody who doesn't fit the traditional mold. Like, for example, like, if somebody, like, since I work for a fintech, I recently, worked with a candidate who had a geography degree, a geography background, right? So different and interesting. So I had to really translate that to help the hiring manager to understand what could be really cool and unique about the kind of value add she could bring, the unique perspective. And I love doing things like that.
I'm muted. There it is. That's really cool. So when you're talking about these folks that, go above and beyond, it's something that I am really trying to get across to the candidates that I work with, because a lot of them are scared to get specific because they're scared it's going to eliminate options. So I'm like, have a point of view, be interested in certain industries over others, like have some sort of opinions so that when you go out there and talk to people, you're not just saying, I'll take anything from anyone, please just give me a job, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, of where that advice might go wrong or where it might be right on point, and what a generic looking person actually looks like to a recruiter. Like if you go to someone's profile and it just says, I'm a UX designer, right? It's what else are you going to find there? So where do you think that people can sort of, let's say, be themselves or show that unique side of themselves, and where might it go too far?
Yeah. I do typically prefer somebody to be more niche and specialized. I feel like it just helps me to be able to then better place them in the right role for them, as well as better be able to discern if the role really is the right fit too. When people are too general, too broad based, I feel like it backfires a lot of times. Like people think they're just being so open-minded and amenable to any job that comes their way. And I struggle with those kinds of people. I do want people to have a passion point, like that's exciting to me. If you are a job seeker that isn't quite sure of what you want to do next, I would say I think you need to narrow that down first before really getting on the phone with recruiters, because I just think it might end up, backfiring. You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot when you're interviewing for jobs, because then I struggle to find that zest, right, of how to like make you fit if I don't have those true selling points to bring to the hiring manager of why you'd be the right fit. So I think it's doing that background work ahead of time, which isn't an easy ask, especially if you're, thinking about like a big career change right now. Can be very daunting. I mean, especially during COVID, and I get that. I just think that when you're talking with somebody like myself, have a point of view, say specifically why you'd be a fit for my company, what kind of background you bring to the table that, could add value. Because otherwise we're just going to go in circles.
Yeah.
It's just not going to work out well for either of us. It's kind of sad to say, but honestly, fairly true from what I've experienced.
And I think that's the misnomer, right? I think people, when they get reached out to by a recruiter, or when they start talking to a recruiter, recruiters can get very excited and they'll be like, yeah, we're so excited about you. And then, everyone complains, oh no, I got ghosted by a recruiter. It's like, maybe not. Maybe they're just busy. But there's this sort of idea in the job seeker mindset that I see all the time, which is, well, I talked to a recruiter this week, so I didn't do anything else with my job search because they're looking for an option for me. And I'm like, oh no, you can't outsource your job search to someone else. That doesn't
Agreed.
work. And I think that we forget, or job seekers forget, that you need to help the recruiter sell you. The recruiter can't do that job for you. They don't know everything about you. So if you can't sell yourself to the recruiter can't sell you to the company, right?
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts on that sort of relationship between the job seeker and the recruiter? And, what should the job seeker be doing to help the recruiter?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that rings so true in so many ways. Like there's so many times where I get on the phone with a candidate and I really want them to be more in the driver's seat. I find that a lot of times people really take that back seat, with the conversation that I have with them, but also, yeah, with their job search at large. They're just like sitting back and being like, yeah, I'm going to push this on you. Like you do your job and get me a job and then it'll all be good. And no, it doesn't work that way. I mean, I do take note of like who brings it, right? When they're on the phone with me, I will make a note when I'm like, submitting my feedback to the hiring manager. Like, did this person, come to the table, like having done their research on the company, talking about, different aspects of the job description and how they are specifically excited about taking on those roles and responsibilities, how their past background relates, and also like driving with thoughtful questions as well. I find that often like it's a bit of like a one-sided tennis match, if that's like a good analogy. Like I'll serve the ball, with a question, and I'm waiting for you to like serve it back. Like, like not just answer, but then say, okay, I'd love to then ask you, how would this then translate to, what the hiring manager is looking for, what the company needs, like, so that it's more of that true conversation, back and forth dialogue. Those are my favorite interviews because they almost don't seem like interviews,
Right.
even though of course they still are.
Yeah.
I still have things that I need to check off my list from that conversation of things we need to cover. But I just way prefer when candidates drive more of that conversation. They're passionate, they're excited about what we're chatting about. And so many times I start out the conversation. I'm like, so what do you know about my company? What have you, what about the job interested you in applying? And people are just like, oh yeah, the position matched what I used to do. And so I applied and here I am, and I make a note of that.
Yeah.
That bothers me because, as a job seeker, especially in such a highly competitive market, you've got to bring your A game. You've got to think, competitively of how you can set you apart from other people that I may be speaking with. So that's such an important distinction.
Yeah, everyone's always like, how come I can't, like, they're like, why do you want to work here? How come I can't just say I need a paycheck? Well, everyone needs a paycheck, man.
Yeah.
Like, of course that doesn't work. We gotta stand out. If you don't want to stand out, then you won't stand out. And that's just what it is. What about when it comes to, the recruiter's perspective, like the amount, I always try and, when I talk to folks who feel like they've been ghosted, I always try to explain the recruiter's mindset or the company's mindset, right? We need to have empathy going both ways, right? If we're going to feel like we deserve to be treated a certain way, we also have to realize that, it goes both ways. So if a company is struggling, chances are they're busy, right? They're not trying to be jerks. If someone goes, it's probably because they're overwhelmed, not because they're trying to be a jerk. So what's that life look like? What does like a recruiter's day-to-day look like? And why might that ghosting happen? Because I think that's a big question that people have.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's not a one size fits all answer. Every company, every recruiter situation is different. First and foremost, I'm definitely in the camp of ghosting just plainly being disrespectful. I don't think it's a good practice in any way, shape, or form. And I certainly try very hard not to be that kind of recruiter. But I do agree with you that recruiters are overwhelmed. I mean, especially right now during COVID, it is at an all-time high where the recruiters who are still employed, I mean, it is enormous the amount of workload that they are carrying. I mean, it's tremendous. And so I would also say that with so many companies having had layoffs, sometimes recruiters are now wearing 2, 3, 4 extra hats that they didn't at the beginning of the year, right? Like, some recruiters have help in terms of like a recruiting coordinator to schedule for interviews, a sourcer to help them to find great talent, maybe sourcing platforms that companies have to pay extra budget for, kind of a thing. A lot of these resources have fallen by the wayside during COVID because companies just don't have budgets. And so what that translates to is it may look on the surface the recruiter still has the same job that they did back in January, but the likely scenario, if you peel that onion layer back, is that they are working insane hours. They are so incredibly stressed and, trying their darndest to keep everything afloat. And again, that doesn't excuse bad behavior of ghosting. I definitely want to make that clear. But at the same time, I think that common courtesies have sadly taken an especially hard hit right now. And that's a tough pill to swallow when you're a job seeker, right? Like all you want, especially if you're full-time on the job search, is that you want answers, right? Especially if you've gotten pretty far along in a process. I stay pretty on top of like those LinkedIn feed posts, and I see those scathing feedback posts about recruiters where people will say, oh yeah, I went through final rounds with a company and put in 5 hours worth of work, for this presentation, XYZ, what have you, and then never heard from the company again, right? I, again, do not agree with that at all. I think that is very, very disrespectful. And I think at the very least, the recruiter can send you an email and say, I'm so sorry, we're not going to be moving forward with you. We've decided to proceed with somebody else in process, etc. Right? But it's happening, and it's happening more than ever.
And I think that's really fair. I always try and say, you have to realize that there, a day or a week for a job seeker, or let's say a day for a job seeker feels like an eternity, but a day for a recruiter is like that. And so a week for a job seeker feels like 10 years, but a week for a recruiter is like, I didn't even get through on my email,
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things it's almost like there's different realities happening on the two sides. It's very interesting. Yeah. And you mentioned the cost, and you mentioned cost cutting. And I think one thing job seekers don't think about or realize is how expensive it is to hire someone.
Oh my gosh.
From beginning through all the interviews with dozens of different people, the multiple touch points, a job seeker will be like, well, I'm not going to do 3 hours of free work for them, like a homework assignment. I mean, it's not really free. They're paying tons of people to interview you for this potential job. And I'm like, and it's, 3 hours of work for potentially 6 figures. That's pretty good. But there's a lot of emotions that get caught up in it and different things like that. Do you have any insights to share around how expensive hiring is from the company's perspective?
Interesting. can totally vary, of course. I know that's not the exact answer that you're looking for, but that's the honest truth. I do think that it's challenging to put like a true dollar amount around it, but I think you're kind of hitting the nail on the head that like, yeah, a lot of people don't realize that like when a company thinks about opening up a new job, there's a lot that happens behind the scenes in terms of getting the job approved and making sure that we have budget for this role and that the budget we have allocated for the compensation is competitive, right? There's a lot of conversations that, we have internally about that because we know how important it is, right? I think there's a lot of cost with the time investment. That is something that I take into very high consideration from both perspectives, both the hiring manager and the interview team, but as well as the candidate, right? And what I mean by that is as we progress in the interview process, that time investment and thus the dollar investment gets higher and higher, right? Because that's more time and energy that maybe like a senior level person that could be allocating that time to, a big scale project or, helping their current team to develop in their careers. They're taking away that time to speak with you, the candidate, right? And so that's something that I always try to think about when I'm, moving candidates further along. And that's part of why hiring managers do value what I'm bringing, because I'll say to them, do you really want to invest the time and energy in this candidate, given that maybe they haven't, done specifically what I know that you're looking for. Or in the case, since I do tech recruiting, say if somebody hasn't really used a certain system like AWS or Java in the last few years, I'll say to them, do you really want to invest the time now? As well as if you hire this person, you're going to have to spend a lot of time training this person and getting them up to speed. So there's even that time and money evaluation for thinking ahead of if we do hire you, then what, right? So yeah, there's so many layers within that. I think candidates don't realize it's happening behind the scenes. And I would say too, what's a hard pill to swallow sometimes is that sometimes I reject people with the best of intentions because we can kind of see that it's going to be too high of a time investment on both sides. It's too much of a stretch, right? I don't want to waste your time either, right? Your time is valuable. Even if you're not currently working, your time is still incredibly valuable, of course. So I'm thinking about those kinds of things too. I don't want you to have to invest that time and energy as well. So yeah, so many different facets.
That's a great point. Sometimes being rejected is a really good thing, and it has nothing to do with our skills. Yeah, I actually had an interview with the university once, like a big name university, and literally in person in the interview, they were going through my resume and they were like, "You've worked at a lot of startups. I think you're going to be bored here." I was like,
blessing in disguise.
I'm like, oh my God, we're in the middle of an interview. And I was like, no, I would be totally happy in this role. And they're like, I don't think so. And looking back, they were totally right. Yeah. We're going to shift over to some of the comments questions in the comments. Okay. So anyone who has questions, feel free to put them in the comments and we'll be getting to that right now. So let's see what people are saying. I plan to be in recruiting, especially in nonprofit. I want to add future programs to innovate students and learn more about it. What are your big challenges as an entry level in the recruiting world?
So like starting out as like a junior recruiter, how to kind of get your wherewithal, like really establish yourself. Yeah, that's interesting, right? I think first and foremost, it depends. Are you a staffing agency, a recruiter, or are you an in-house recruiter? So since I'm not quite sure which avenue you're taking, I'll kind of talk to both sides on that. So me personally, I started out my recruiting career as a staffing agency recruiter. I knew right out of the gate that like I had to place somebody in my first like 30 to 60 days. Like that was just so critical for me establishing myself as, somebody who was serious about the role and could really make an impact on my organization. And so I first and foremost did everything that I could to learn about my company. I really wanted to learn all the ins and outs of the organization, so that way I could talk in an educational manner to candidates about what my company could offer, what made us different, and why they should be working with us, with me, etc. I also shadowed a lot of more senior recruiters. Actually, I would sit with them in a room, and this was back when we were in the office, of course, a little bit different now that we're all fully virtual. But I would sit with them and just be an ear, listen to their phone conversations. What kinds of questions were they asking candidates? How were they discerning if somebody was good for a role, if they were not good for a role? What would they do to advocate for them, to the company, the client, etc. So I just wanted to really be that sponge, if you will, to soak everything in and then really showcase my knowledge to my manager, to the candidates I was working with, and to my clients. And so you got to put in that work, especially when you're new, right? A little bit of hustle in there for sure, especially when you're an agency recruiter, because it's very much a sales job in some senses because you're commission based. So now for an in-house recruiter, I would say relationship building with your hiring managers, with your recruitment team, as well as other people within your HR or people operations organization. Those three components are so critical. So I spent a lot of time, at my current company, having sit down one-on-one conversations with, senior leaders I was going to be hiring, for their teams, for listening to them, what has worked well for them, where, they felt like there were areas for growth and opportunity, etc. I really wanted to learn more about other aspects of the HR organization. What does our compensation analyst do, and how do they come up with a competitive base salary range, right? Just things like that. So that way I was just fully informed. So it's work for sure. I mean, you really have to establish yourself, but I think like if you really make sure that you take those strides early on, it's going to be that great building block for you to build your career.
And I got to give you props and credit. When you were in Chicago, I think networking was the key thing that stood out to me. You were always on top of it, always connecting with people. We ran into each other at like events all the time.
Yeah.
So that was definitely at the height of my networking, and probably the height of yours as well. And so putting in that work, putting in that hustle is incredibly important. This next question is a long one, so bear with me as I read it out. Zachary asks, as a recruiter, I'm sure you receive a lot of communication from job seekers. So we've talked a little bit about this, but we'll add in a little more detail. Do you find that managing so many contacts makes following up when one of them doesn't pan out or isn't a good fit too difficult to do? If not, how often do you find yourself reaching back out 2, 3, 4 weeks later? I think this is going to be the part that we focus on. When something does pop up that matches a candidate that didn't pan out. Being a prior PM, I'd suspect that you might be more organized than some others. So how often do things come back around? Like, when you put someone back in the queue?
Yeah. depends. I think a lot of what people don't realize is that recruiters are estimating and guesstimating a lot of times on time frames. It's not that we don't want to be forthright. Sometimes we have to buy time because we know that, like, internally, sometimes decisions can take a while. So, because I have strong relationships with my hiring managers, sometimes they might say to me, "Oh, I'm really thinking about hiring for a senior software engineer in the next month or two." So they'll kind of give me that heads up, right? And so, if I'm talking to somebody, I might say, "Oh, yeah, the hiring manager has mentioned to me that they are really looking to grow their team in the short term, but we don't have a specific position posted currently," right? And it's tough because, that hiring manager may think they want to, post an open role. They may have the full intention of wanting to move forward with it, but then maybe their senior leader thinks otherwise, or maybe finance says, "That's great and all, but we've got to give budget to a different team," right? And then it just doesn't pan out. So, that's where I might say, I think this might come down the pipeline in a month or two, but I don't have something concrete, right? Like, what I try to do is just be as honest and transparent as I possibly can. I try to treat others like I want to be treated. I never want to steer you incorrectly to say, "Oh, yes, this is definitely opening in 2 weeks," if I don't know, concretely that it is, right? I just want to make sure on that. Now, I can't speak the same for other recruiters. Everybody operates differently. So, it's hard to say if they're telling you, "Oh, yeah, position's going to open," it's hard to not get your hopes up. I do want to address the other part of the question of how much would I then think to call you when that position comes up. That's a tough one, right? That's a real tough one. Sometimes, like, I've certainly had conversations with candidates where I'm like, "Yes, this person is an A player. They're fantastic. Like, I love, their background. I love their personality. I think that they're going to bring a lot to the table." But then when a position opens up and I'm thinking back to that person, there may not be a match, right? It may be trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. And so I may not call you, right? Because I don't want to force things. So, and I think that can be tough from a job seeker's perspective, especially if they're doing all the right things. But at the end of the day, I'm still trying to look out for you, and I'm still trying to look out for, my team, the hiring manager, et cetera, to make sure that it is that right fit. If you do talk to a recruiter and then you see a job that gets posted on their career site and you're like, "Yeah, this really aligns with my background," follow up with the recruiter, right? Like, you probably have their direct email. Like, message them and say, "Hey, like, I saw that this job just got posted, would love to chat with you about this new role if possible." Like, yeah, go for it. What I tend to find, though, is that people are trying to force things. They're coming to me about opportunities that they're not the right fit for. They're just wanting any job, kind of going back to our conversation earlier of just thinking too broadly. I would say just go to the recruiter if it's something that really does align with your background. You really do see this being a match from your standpoint as well, because you don't want to waste your time or the recruiters. So.
Yeah. And I like that you phrased it that way. Saw this opportunity. I think it's a good fit. Would love to get on the phone and chat. I think so often people forget that the whole purpose here is to have conversations with people, right? And to your point earlier, it's like almost every conversation that is slightly professional is an interview, even if it's like a networking thing or very formal. I always say that a real, like an in-person interview where you're wearing a suit and you're doing the whole deal is just an incredibly formal version of a coffee chat. And so if you can get really good at coffee chats, you can get really good at interviewing.
Yeah.
And I think that, people forget that you need a call to action, or you need to do something in your email to help the recruiter, right? It's not just, hey, is that job open? Can you give me that job? Where's
Oh
that
my
job?
God, yeah.
And it's like, no. Be like, hey, can we chat about that and see if it's a good fit? Here's something that I found that might be helpful, or something along those lines, I think is really big. And you also touched on like timing too. I appreciate you saying, like, it's not a hard, fast process. There are lots of decision makers and lots of people who have their, hands in the mix. And so
Yep.
when someone says, like, when someone will go on an interview and they'll be like, yeah, we'll get back to you by Friday. And they'll go, I'm going to know if I have a job on Friday. And I always go, chill out. You're not going to know if you have a job on Friday, maybe if we're lucky. But every time, I have sort of like a rule of thumb that, like, every time you get a day, like they say we're going to get to you in this time frame, I always double the time frame just to keep myself sane.
Yeah.
Because I know that person's going to go have to talk to another person. That person's going to have to bring the team together. They're going to have to organize everyone's schedules to get a conversation happening. There's going to be a bunch of emails back and forth. One person's going to be out of the office, and then something is going to happen, and then 2 weeks will go by, and the job seeker will lose their mind. And so, if you've ever worked at a company, you kind of know that every time there's a deadline, there's like 100 people that get involved in it. And so I always try and help people realize that, like, these timelines are not set in stone. They are fluid, and it's important to be fluid with them. So I appreciate you sharing that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say real quickly, I think probably a good analogy to use here that might help to frame things a little bit further is when you go to a restaurant and you ask the host or hostess, how long's the wait time? How long is it going to be until my table's ready, right? They might say, oh yeah, the table over here is finishing up. They'll probably be done in the next 10 to 20 minutes, and then those people end up sitting there talking for the next hour and a half, right? So, I think it's so darn similar with recruiting. Like, I might guesstimate and think that I might have a decision for you by Friday, and I'm well-intentioned when I tell you that. But yeah, there's so much that can happen behind the scenes that could upend that.
So true. And we have a follow-up from Zachary. Follow-up to my question: how do you stand out to a recruiter in a market where there is a larger number of candidates searching for employment? The strongest resume or the more persistent? Is it the strongest resume or the more persistent candidate that's most appealing? I can't read today. Most appealing. I think persistence is an interesting one. Where does the line of persistence to being a bother? Where is that line?
It's a fine line for sure. Yeah. I mean, you want to be careful about that. You want to show interest, but at the same time, not desperation, right?
A lot of time it's tone, right?
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think kind of go back to what we were chatting about earlier. Are you, when you're communicating with me, are you just saying, hey, Jenny, where's my application at? Bye. Because I get some of those and I'm like, all right, let's reel it back now. I want people who, when they're coming to me, they're saying, I just wanted to follow up with you about our conversation previously. I'm super excited and invested in the opportunity because of X, Y, and Z. Please let me know if I'm still a consideration or if you've moved forward with other candidates, right? I appreciate those thoughtful messages. Much more highly, right? I mean, that's going to go to the top of my inbox kind of a situation, right? But yeah, I mean, go directly to the heart of this question about, like, how to stand out. I think that's a big one right now. Like, I've been watching LinkedIn applications, and especially where I'm living in New York, I mean, you can see a job that gets posted, and right now, I mean, within the first 48, 72 hours, there's 300 applicants. I mean, it is the wild, wild west right now with like applications and the amount of job seekers on the market. So I get it, right? Like I get how hard it is. But yeah, I love the question about how to stand out. And I think it's a critical one. I would say from a resume perspective, there's some little things you can do, and there's also bigger pieces of the pie. From a little perspective, I would say, me personally, I love a well-designed, modern, clean template with a pop of color. I feel like that kind of goes against traditionally what a lot of advice online tends to steer people within. And I'll explain my rationale. When I'm super busy and I'm one of those recruiters that's receiving several hundred applications for a role, I mean, it's so many of the same plain, boring Microsoft Word documents with very little formatting. And my eyes start to glaze over after a period of time, right? I mean, I'm only human, right? So if you can stand out, like you've got this really nicely formatted resume that shows you put a lot of time and energy into it, that's a breath of fresh air to me. Like, I mean, that immediately pops out because so few people do it. So I love when I see that, right? So that's immediately going to turn the switch on, if you will. Now, that's not necessarily going to get me to contact you, but it's a good step in the right direction. I would say from a bigger piece of the pie standpoint is I like to see accomplishments that are backed up by metrics. This is huge. So many people just list their general roles and responsibilities, their day-to-day, what have you, and it's a miss. It's such a huge miss. When we're going back to our conversation about A players, me fighting for a candidate with a hiring manager, fighting for somebody, right? Like, I want somebody who is going to specifically call out tangibly how they have added value to their last organization or last, several prior organizations, ideally, in a multitude of areas that can be measured. So, for example, you want to say something to the effect of, I, collaborated with 3 cross-functional teams over the course of 6 months, which resulted in a 20% cost reduction for the company, something like that, right? And of course, there's many different ways you can approach it, but that's generally kind of what I'm looking for. But doing that will immediately help to bring, the attention to you in a good way. You want to stand out.
That's awesome. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, especially as, I talk with people all the time and I say, do you know the ROI of your role? Right. I had a call yesterday with 60 different job seekers. And I was like, who here can tell me the value that your role in UX brings to a company? And they're like, no one said anything first. And then they're like, well, I really like to design nice things. And I'm like, it has nothing to do with what you like to do. If you like to design nice things, go be a painter, right? Like, unless the thing you design helps the business in a bottom line way, they can't justify paying you money. And like, that is a key thing that everyone forgets in the job search because they're just so focused on getting themselves a salary to pay their own bills, which is totally understandable, but is missing the whole sales side of things.
Gosh, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I think that is a critical piece of the puzzle that job seekers rarely think about, the lens from the company that's hiring for this role. I think if you kind of take a step back of what you want, you need, and that's hard to do. Not many people are adapted at doing something like that. it's so critical, as you were saying, to think about the true ROI of what that company needs you to bring to the table. Yeah, why they're going to be paying you a salary at the end of the day, why they're justifying you being a strong member of the team generally, right? So, yeah, I mean, if you can, think from that standpoint and then apply that to your resume. And again, that's not an easy thing that takes time to become good at. That is so going to work in your favor.
And then I would be remiss to not bring up the ATS, applicant
Yeah.
tracker systems. How are they utilized by recruiters, and what tips do you have for folks?
So there's several different kinds of applicant tracking systems on the market. So just kind of depends on the company and which one they're currently using. So you can often see when you're applying that it'll say like powered by JobVite or powered by Greenhouse, or I don't know if that's necessarily going to tell you something, from a job seeker's perspective. But yeah, essentially, like an applicant tracking system is what recruiters use to track applicants. I mean, just kind of like how it says when you apply to a job, you are essentially entering your information into our database. So that way we have your information on file for both positions that are open now, as well as potentially in the future. So, yeah, I mean, essentially, what's kind of interesting to know is, how resumes and cover letters as well may show up when you apply, what it looks like from the recruiter side of things. And it varies. I can tell you from having used different ATS systems. Like I know in past companies where I worked, I had to really actually struggle to see if somebody attached a cover letter, which is interesting. A lot of people don't realize that. Like it didn't call out when somebody applied, like if a cover letter was attached, like I almost had to like dig for it. It was
Weird.
kind of an outdated system, to be honest. The current system I use is Greenhouse, and Greenhouse, from what I understand, is the most popularly used ATS in the United States. So you'll often find Greenhouse as the main ATS of choice, especially for smaller to mid-sized companies. Typically not as much for like your larger, more established institutions. Can vary though. But yeah, I mean, when I look at an application, I'll see the cover letter first and then the resume. And I want to actually be frank in saying I typically skip right over the cover letter and go to the resume. I want to make sure your audience knows that it's not worth it to spend time on a cover letter. When I'm busy, I frankly just don't have time to read it. I just need to get to the meat and potatoes that is your resume. Is your background a fit or is it not? So that's where I would highly recommend don't spend a ton of time writing cover letters. They very, very rarely result in getting read and getting you the results that you're thinking you're going to get from tweaking and tailoring. And that pains me because I know so many people spend hours upon hours of crafting the perfect messaging, and I'm here to say it rarely gets read. I mean, it's
Will you get screened if you don't have a cover letter?
I prefer it. I mean, it's weird, but I think cover letters are just such an old school mentality that you needed to have them.
They
when
were
you applied
literally
for a job.
from the age of faxing. That's what
Yes,
it is. It's a
yeah.
cover letter is supposed to be part of a fax. It's it's terrible.
Yeah, I hear you.
So we have a couple things, and we are at just about at time. But I just want to hit on a couple of things because most of the audience here are people who are making a career change. So they're going through a boot camp and they're coming out the other side trying to get their entry level first job in an industry. And you talked a little bit about, you work with people who are definitely more experience for those more specialized jobs. And you talked about some of these staffing companies and how they work with folks in a more mass way. And, Zachary has a follow-up question here. As a candidate that's switching career paths, a lot of my accomplishments don't directly translate to this new path. But quantifying my worth, ROI, from my previous roles is something I've always made a point to track. Is this abstract kind of assessment something that you find you have time to do, or is this something that is a potential handicap? So the old experience relating to the new role. And I just think that there's generally this sense of like, how helpful can a recruiter be to someone who's in that transitional space, who doesn't have a background, who is maybe let's say a hard sell? What would you say about folks in that area and how they might best be able to work with a recruiter?
Yeah. Honestly, my personal recommendation is to really not start with recruiters if you're completely looking to switch careers, because especially right now with it being such a competitive market, we can be so discerning to only move forward the people who have the exact right background. And that's the hard truth about it. What I would recommend for somebody who maybe is a recent grad or looking to switch careers is, not to go the recruiter route nearly as much, but to reach out to people who are more your peers, like to do more of that. I mean, right now it has to be virtual online networking. In the past, I would say, network and go to events and talk to people in person. But right now, I think it's important to, reach out to people who are maybe fellow, like if you're a boot camp grad, reach out to people who maybe graduated from similar programs, but are a year or two in now that they've, been successful at like transitioning into their careers, right? Like pick their brains. How did they do it, right? So you want to maybe start with some of those informational interviews, if you will. I think those people would be super excited typically to like, because they probably rarely get reached out to. It's more like the recruiters, the senior level hiring managers that get bombarded with, requests. The more junior level folks, not so much. And they're going to be probably more apt to take that time investment with you to say, here are the steps that I took to get my foot in the door. Here's what I would recommend for you. And that's a great way to just, learn more about, their transition, as well as, do they like the company that they're working for? Do they feel like their boot camp really prepared them well for their job, or do they feel like they had to keep going, taking more online courses, or tapping into internal learning and development opportunities, maybe a combination? But pick their brains, right? I think that's such a critical component that I think a lot of people just don't take advantage of.
That's refreshing to hear. I really appreciate that, because it's a lot of what I say as well. I say, maybe it's not the best time to be outsourcing your search. Right now, when you're making this transition, you should be building a foundation for the next 10 years, not just looking for the next job. And meeting these people, regardless of whether or not they can get you a job immediately, will help you 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. So I think that's really great. We do have to wrap up. And so I know there's a couple questions we didn't get to, but Jenny, if folks wanted to reach out to you and get in touch, what would be the best things to reach out about, and how can they get in touch with you?
You can definitely reach me on LinkedIn, and kind of how we were chatting about, like, if you reach out to me, come to me with a specific question, right? Like come to me with something interesting, meaty, right? Don't just say, hey, I, saw you on this webcast and let's connect, or just generally let's connect, a friend request. I want to see something more interesting, and then, can certainly try to help where I can.
Wonderful. Well, this was a perspective that was sorely needed for our audience. They've been asking for it for a long time. So Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today and bringing your thoughts on the industry. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me again. And, lovely to, virtually connect with you out there, the audience at large. And looking forward to seeing what's next for you and this podcast and such. So.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much. And we'll close out the stream in just a second.
Awesome.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on, I lost the branding at the top. There it is. Hey, Get Up and Job Search, Martin McGovern, Career Therapy. It's been a pleasure having you all here, and good luck with your job search. Reach out with any other questions, and if you have more folks you'd like to see on the show, let me know. Different, recruiters, different industry leaders. We can always start bringing more of these to you. Good luck, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.